I'm Nikki Jovic from LookUpStrata. After reading an ABC News article about recent troubles at another New South Wales apartment building with severe defects, the article mentioned that the owners had been pursuing the builder for defects since 2018. A new apartment owner purchased into the scheme in May and seemed to have known nothing about the problems when he purchased just 6 months ago. Why was this new owner unaware of the issues before purchasing? What could he have done differently? To answer these questions and more, I'm chatting quickly today with Michael Ferrier, Managing Director of EYEON Property Inspections. Thanks for joining me today, Michael.
Hi, Nikki. Good to see you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much for jumping on and having a chat.
You're welcome.
So I just wanted to mention what we've just spoken about. It was that ABC article that kind of has started this discussion. Yeah. So are there risks in buying into newer apartment buildings in New South Wales?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are risks in buying into any building that people need to consider, but newer buildings, yes, we're inspecting the records of thousands of apartment buildings every year. And newer buildings, yes, we do see specific risks in buying into those, and most of those risks are around defects and the process for addressing and resolving those defects. Now, that building that you've mentioned that was in that article is obviously at one end of that risk spectrum, and there'll be other buildings that are way at the other end that are, a pretty low risk, where there's a good process for addressing any issues. The owners and the builder developer are on top of it, and really there's not much disruption. There's also a lot of buildings in the middle where the process is a long and drawn out process and can sometimes, not uncommonly, result in the owners incurring disruption and some financial cost to get those defects rectified, because whatever the settlement is with the builder or the developer, or whatever can be paid out from insurance proceeds, isn't enough to fix the issues.
Okay, so all newer buildings equally risky for what you've just been saying there? There is quite a scope. No,
they're not. And again, this can come down to a few factors. So one is who built it. So some construction businesses will be better than others, and they'll have a better track record than others. Others, in other situations, the building may be more complex. In other situations, again, there may have just been poor workmanship in that particular build. The most common issue that we see is water penetration issues. So water getting into the building because of poor waterproofing or sealing in balconies, windows, doors, or water penetration inside the building, usually from, again, poor sealing in wet areas like bathrooms. That's the biggest issue that we commonly see in the documents and the defects reports that we see in newer builds. So it does vary from building to building, but if you're buying into a building that's, let's say 5 years old or less, then you should definitely be looking at this issue, where they're up to with the defects process, what's the history been, what's the relationship like with the developer and contractor in getting defects done. And then you'll see costs. They're starting to incur costs for legal expenses, for expert reports, and so on. And that's why we're sometimes seeing strata reports that are 1,000 pages long, because in that 1,000 pages, there's a 500 or 600 page defects report that is showing all of the issues, across, all of the different units and common areas in the building.
So aren't new buildings covered by a building warranty in that instance?
Yeah, there are statutory warranties. There's a 2-year statutory warranty in New South Wales for minor defects and a 6-year statutory warranty for major defects. And buildings often have to make sure that they're filing a defects claim with the developer for those issues within those timeframes. So while there's some protection there, and there's usually insurance in place as well, it's not as simple as that, because if there's resistance from the developer or builder to fix the problems, or if there are major problems, then the process will go on and on. And then there'll be issues about whether the builder stays solvent, for example, or whether they are looking to make a settlement, or whether they legally defend their position actively, and the owners corporation then have to defend their position, and that gets expensive. So there's a whole lot of complicated things that happen. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, there's a warranty, I'm okay, because it's not as simple as that. I mean, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a builder, but there's all sorts of complications there that affect the process.
So what are the risks, financial, practical and personal, in buying into a new apartment building in New South Wales?
Well, let's just look at them quickly and separately. So financially, there is a risk, and we do see this in some buildings, where at the end of the day, the owners finish up having to pay some of the rectification costs for building defects in newer buildings. In some cases, that cost can be in the millions of dollars. So there's a potential financial cost depending on the circumstances in the building. At a practical level, there's leaks in the building. There's disruption in the building because there's ongoing maintenance or rectification works going on. And so that quiet enjoyment that you think you're entitled to when you buy a property is lost, sometimes can be lost for a number of years. So that's a very practical cost associated. If you're buying the property as an investment and you want to have tenants, it's going to be harder to let because of those issues. If there's scaffolding around the building and for long periods of time, that type of thing, they're practical issues. And then at a personal level, we see in these cases, these high risk cases where people have had to move out of the building because the issues have become so severe, or there's mold issues that means it's unsafe for them to stay in their apartment. And so their whole life is turned upside down because of these defects. So they're just examples. And of course, the financial pressure it can put on people can lead to other personal costs as well. So they're examples of those sorts of issues. And I think I think that people need to think about these things before they jump into buying into a newer building sometimes. Yeah.
And you've mentioned sometimes these issues are drawn out over quite a few number of years, but also in the same instance, sometimes they need immediate injections of money, don't they, to quickly make defect rectifications for safety purposes.
That's right. That's right. And ultimately that money sometimes has to come from the owners, and that means they either have to raise a special levy or they need to get funding through a strata loan. And ultimately that strata loan will have to be repaid, including the interest, by the owners. And so ultimately it still means special levies, but maybe it allows them to spread it over a few years. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how can purchasers, like the one that was mentioned in the article that we're talking about, how could they reduce their risk of buying into something like that, like a bad building that has lots of defect issues that could end up costing quite a lot of money in the future?
Well, there's a few ways. I mean, obviously you can just do some online research first off. So you can Google to see if there's any stories about that building. You might be able to find out very easily who the builder or developer was for that building and see if they've been issues with other buildings that they've built, to see what their track record is like. But ultimately, the best way to check it out is to see what's going on in the building. And the only way to really do that, other than walking around and getting a sense of, what's the building look like? Are there things that stand out to a layperson as not looking quite right? Is to have a look at the records for the building, see what's been happening, one, financially, what's been happening with legal action, what's been happening with expert reports, and so on. So we're often seeing when we're inspecting records, 500-page defect reports in newer buildings. And if you want to spend a bit of time, you can go through and look at the types of defects that they're identifying. As I said before, water penetration is the most common one of those. And that will give people a sense of what the level of defects are, but then also what's the process been like? Is it combative with the builder developer, or do they seem to have a really good process for fixing the defects and working with the building and their advisors? So that can be a good way for people to least understand what they're buying into. So it may be not a question of saying, oh, I don't want to touch this building because it's got defects. There'll be defects in just about every building, but to understand what you're up for, or have a sense of that, I think is really important for any owner. And that's probably the best thing to look at before you make a decision. And I certainly would never be buying any apartment without understanding what's going on in that building. And remembering that you're buying into a community situation here, and that you are responsible for your share of the costs of running and maintaining that building. So you need to understand what that means. And the only way to do that is to have a closer look at the records and the finances. And an important part of what we do, although we prepare a report on the records, probably the most important part of our service is getting on the phone and talking to people and explaining to them what's going on, because for a lot of people, they don't have much experience of buying into a strata plan. They don't really understand what strata is and what the consequences are, the obligations are, and what the financial costs can be. And so we can explain what the documents are and what they mean to them, and that can often give people a much better sense of what the decision they're about to make.
We regularly receive questions in from people saying that they didn't even know that they were buying into a strata, and then once they might have heard the word strata, but they certainly didn't understand what obligations they were buying into when they purchased. So I think that's a really important point, Michael. And I was going to ask you as well, I know we've spoken about it previously, we've always been in favour of people going out and getting those reports beforehand, but you mentioned about the service that you provide. So there is a real difference in the quality of the report that you can get done, isn't there, across the board? There are some places that wouldn't offer the services that you would offer to actually give you an insight into what the report is highlighting.
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to that. Yes, I mean, we think that follow-up process is very important. And so we really encourage people to ask questions. The other part of it is that searching the records is not a straightforward process, particularly in some buildings. And so we have pretty sophisticated quality control stuff built in, so that we're trying to make sure that the report can provide the best quality information that we can. And I think that's really important as well. This industry of strata records inspections is a cottage industry, and largely it's done by individuals who run their own business, who don't have anybody to support them. And so what the support that we provide to our inspectors who inspect the records is an important aspect of what we do, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I thought I'd highlight that point because I know you've got so much knowledge to share. You regularly contribute to questions that we have come in from our audience, and you have a real understanding. And I know you're passionate about education as well.
And so I also make this, and I often do this when I do calls like this, is that if you're looking at buying into an apartment, and even if we haven't done a report on it, but you have some concerns or questions, give us a call. We're happy to help you. We're happy to do what we can to help you and help you understand what you're doing. It's sort of part of what we do, and I firmly believe that it pays us back anyway by offering that sort of extended service. So we're happy to do that. Don't be shy if you have questions. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm sure some of our listeners will take you up on that as well.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so just one other thing that I wanted to mention to you. So what are the sorts of things buyers should be looking for before they decide to buy?
So for buyers that haven't lived in apartments before, some of that discussion we just talked about. So what is it you're buying into? Why is it different from the house you may have owned before if you're looking to downsize, as an example? So I think understanding the difference between apartment living and living in a house is an important consideration. Community aspects. So what does it mean to be living in a community of owners? And what's that community going to look like? I think there's again an understanding that I think some people think they're going to live in an apartment and, it'll just be, my little part of this world, and it's not really like that. So you need to have an understanding that you're part of a bigger picture. And then obviously getting an understanding of what the ongoing financial commitment is, because in a strata building, you've got ongoing quarterly levies. What are they for? What do they mean? You need to understand that part of them are for the day-to-day running of the business, and part of them are a saving fund for future capital maintenance in the building. Are they enough? Is there a bit of a history of them having to raise additional funds, and what does that mean? A lot of people are really pushing themselves to their financial limits when they buy into a property, and they're not anticipating the fact that they may have to pay a lump sum special levy at some point in the future. And that can cause a lot of strain on people. So having a really good understanding of what the financial position of the building is like, what its history has been, and then obviously if we're talking about newer buildings, is understanding where the building is up to in its defects process, because all the buildings will go through this. Some sail through it smoothly. Others, like the one in the ABC story we started with, clearly don't. And so it's really important for them to understand before they make a decision. At the moment, obviously the market's been very active and there's been pressure. There's been a mismatch between supply and demand. And so there's pressure on buyers to make quick decisions, but those quick decisions can be dangerous. And so you need to understand there are consequences if you don't understand what you're buying into. So I think that's probably the key point. Some people might feel like they have to move quickly, and as a result, they don't do the due diligence they may normally do. But ultimately, you still get people who just make a decision based on emotion and really don't check things out, the way they should. It's going to happen. And maybe, on the outside, the building looks fine. And they like the location and lots of other things about it, and they just go ahead and make a decision, and then ultimately, it's worked out badly in this case.
So I wonder whether, because from what I read in that report, it looked as if you went down into the basement and actually had a look, you possibly would have seen those cracks anyway. So, yeah. I mean, are they just, is that another thing? Is it worthwhile for the purchaser to actually have a walk around themselves, and if they've got any issues like that, to kind of flag them?
Well, they can. I mean, look, unless you're highly qualified in this stuff, you wouldn't know whether those things are serious or not. And, if you go into the basements of a lot of apartment buildings, there will be moisture and it will look a bit untidy. Now, it doesn't mean that it's structurally unsafe, but those basements are underground. And so it's hard to make them completely watertight, is the reality that people say. But that doesn't mean that they're not engineeringly sound. They're not sound in an engineering sense. It's probably better English. And then so that sort of stuff's difficult for the layperson. But this is where, if you do get a strata report and there's a 500-page defect report that lists out all these issues and identifies them as defects, then you get a pretty clear picture that, hell, there's a lot going on in here. And a lot of that stuff, even at that point, it may not be terrible if the developer builder is actively fixing stuff. But then, it's then when you get issues where, either the issues are much more serious, as in that example. There's been a few high-profile examples where there's been serious structural issues where people have had to move out, and so on. But even in cases where they haven't had to move out, there's a massive disruption, and it goes on for years. I was giving a session to some buyers agents about strata reports, and one of the agents saying that they've been living in a building and the defects issue's been going on for 7 years. They bought off the plan, and this is another problem, is people buy off the plan, and so they buy this brand new apartment, and then they get there and it turns into a bit of a nightmare. So so it's it is and it's a relatively common problem in newer buildings. So, and we see this as we inspect buildings, there's a bit of a rhythm to this, is that in a lot of buildings that they, obviously these defects present themselves, and the most common defects are water penetration. So this is issues with waterproofing on balconies, in wet areas, bathrooms, and so on. And so they're getting leaks, water coming into the building or leaking between floors, etc. And that can often, as you can imagine, the rectification of those issues is a massive job, because they've got to pull all the tiles up, re-waterproof, and so on. So we see that quite regularly, and obviously that's very expensive as well. But then obviously you get other issues in rarer cases where you have genuine structural problems, you know, cracks and major cracks that we, you know, in this example. Then you had the Mascot Towers as another Sydney building where they had those problems. But interestingly, in that case, you know, we had inspected the records in that building a number of times, and those issues were around for years before they became serious. And the owners kept pushing it down the line. It didn't get resolved. And then all of a sudden it became an urgent safety issue, and people had to move out. So, you know.
So you're talking about newer buildings, Michael. Like how new is a newer building?
Probably 5 years old or newer would be probably what you regard. You'd think that buildings that are more than 5 years old would have any issues identified and sorted out. But there'll be rare cases where there's defects ongoing for longer than that. As I said in that example of the buyer's agent I was talking to, who'd been, you know, they've been going on for 7 years. So that's rare cases. I mean, I've heard some people say they wouldn't look, another buyer's agent saying they wouldn't even look for a client at a building that was newer than, that was newer than 5 years. So because there's been so many issues with this. And the risk is that even once all the defects are identified, there's often big financial risks for the owners, because the cost of rectification is more than the builder is prepared to pay, or the insurance companies are prepared to pay. And so they can be left holding the baby, so to speak. In some cases, it's millions of dollars that the owners have to find to get things fixed. So yeah, it's a common enough problem that anybody looking at a newer building should be looking closely at it. And that's not to say that all new buildings have big problems. They definitely don't. And one other thing that potential buyers can look at is to see who built it, who developed it, what their reputation has been like in other buildings, not only in terms of the quality of construction, but how they perhaps respond to the defects process. Because let's face it, all buildings will have some defects. All properties, houses will have some defects. It's then a question of how they get resolved and to what extent they're serious. So, yeah.
And when you talk about looking into the developer themselves and doing some research, that's something that's really changed in New South Wales recently, or it's about to change with the implementation of the different stages of what's happening with the New South Wales Building Commissioner.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
yeah.
did you want to talk about that?
I saw him interviewed. I don't know whether it was the same ABC thing, but he seemed to be taking a very hard line. And saying, you know, I'll name and shame these people, and I'll make sure that they're held responsible for what they do. And look, many will say it's been a long time coming, because there's been quite poor construction stuff going on, you know, in a lot of cases, and for quite a long time. And so the issues in the early stages with defects are a problem. But then, because of poor build quality, then the buildings can start to look shabby after a few years. Now, that's the sort of stuff that people who are coming to look at a building that might be more than 5 years old could see on presentation, that it starts to look shabby, presents badly. Now, they're the sort of telltale signs that we can't see because we don't go to a building when we're inspecting strata records, but somebody who's checking a property out, you know, can look around them and see how's the building present. You know, what does it look like? Is it look tired, even though it's not an old building, for example? So,
okay, and that's when
another
kind of
element of qualitative sort of due diligence that people can take. You know,
and then that would start alarm bells ringing, Michael, and you'd start to think, well, you know, maybe there's not enough time being spent on looking at maintenance, and maybe possibly not enough money in the sinking fund to keep up with maintenance, or money's going somewhere else.
Yes, exactly. And again, that's another common problem, is that there's not enough money saved in capital works funds / sinking funds. And so when maintenance is required, it gets pushed down the line a bit because they haven't got the money now. And then, of course, it becomes more important or more urgent. And then they've got to raise money, special levies, loans, however they decide to do it. And then because they've had to find all this extra money and pay these extra levies, then they don't want the quarterly levies to go up as well. And so the problem can then re-emerge again some years later. Now, that's, you see this quite a bit where buildings, you know, do need to raise special levies fairly regularly, and it's just that their levies are not high enough. And sometimes buyers look at a building and think it's attractive because the levies are very reasonable. And sometimes the levies are very reasonable because they're not high enough. And again, that will either present itself through a history of special levies, or perhaps the fact that the building again is starting to look a bit tired because it's not having that ongoing maintenance it should have. So,
and I guess that's something I hadn't thought about. If you've actually got a fairly urgent maintenance issue and you're raising a lot of special levies to fix that maintenance issue, you still then have to be keeping an eye on that capital works fund, don't you? Because there are still things that are scheduled in 5 or 10 years' time that will be possibly neglected if all of your money's going into fixing this major defect problem that you've currently got.
Exactly, that is true. And, you know, the biggest ticket items for a lot of buildings, painting, for example, now that's not going away. Even if you've got waterproofing problems or what have you, those issues still have to be addressed at some point. And so you need to have the money put away for that. And a lot of buildings don't do that very well. They have a capital works fund forecast because they're required to get one in New South Wales. But then they don't follow it and they don't get it updated regularly enough. It's a 10-year forecast, so they think they can just, you know, use the same plan for 10 years. Well, it shouldn't be like that. It should be updated every few years. The cost of getting it updated is a small cost in a medium to large building. Yet for some reason we see them deferring these decisions all the time. And that may be a combination of not wanting to spend the money on the consultant to get the report done, or it may be we don't really want to see a new report because we don't want our levies to go up type of thing. And it's sort of head in the sand mentality. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I was talking to, I think it was Kayleen Arcol from Leary & Partners up in Queensland, and Kayleen was saying that she believes that the 10-year capital works or maintenance plan for the capital works fund should actually be pushed out to 15 years. Would you agree with that?
No. I mean, I would go the other way. I mean, look, it can be, I mean, we do see some plans that are forecast for 15 years.
Yes.
My point is not the length of the forecast. Having a 15-year forecast might be fine because it might then show you the full cycle of maintenance, say for painting, for example, that a 10-year forecast may not always pick up. If that's her point, then I understand that. But on the other hand, because it's a 15-year forecast doesn't mean you rely on that forecast for 15 years. My view is that these things, particularly for larger buildings, should probably be updated every 2 to 3 years. And I think because situations will change, and one of the real benefits of doing regular updates is that the forecast will become more accurate every time you update it because you're able to put in live numbers. as to what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, and then that will make your next forecast a bit more accurate. And so I think if buildings took a more proactive approach to that stuff, it would help. So. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think that was Kayleen's point. She was saying that she thinks it should be done regularly, but it should be done for that longer period of time so you could get more of a picture of what was going to be happening.
Yeah, I understand what she's saying with that. Yeah.
Okay. And I think it's a great idea for you saying that it's a live document, isn't it? And I mean, you can make something, that forecasts the next 10 years, but things will happen during the time. It won't ever follow that plan for 10 years.
No, it won't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they've got to do it more actively for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The other thing that can really help with buyer confidence, and this is something that owners should be thinking about, is providing better information in their minutes. So we see some buildings are very good at providing an annual update at their AGM. This is what's happening. This is what we've planned. This is where our finances sit, etc. A proper annual review of the building and what's happened and what's happening looking forward. Now, when you see buildings like that, you know that the owners have an interest in keeping the building in good shape, and they've got a plan they're looking forward. And anybody looking at that building would feel a bit more confident about buying into that property than into one where you don't see any of that stuff. There's just the compliance style minutes that really have very little information in them. That makes it difficult for buyers to understand the culture of the building, if you want, because as you well know, it's a community. What you're buying into when you buy into an apartment building is a community, and you want to know that what sort of a community that is if you're going to be a potential owner there. So you can read some of that from the documents sometimes, the sense of of what the owner's attitude is. Yeah.
And engagement, I guess, as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But there's a commitment required by some owners to achieve that sort of culture. But again, if people are unsure, and they want to ask some questions, then we're happy to sort of, we can provide some advice to them or some suggestions to them based on our own experience if they want to give us a call. Yeah.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Michael. That was a really great discussion, and I'm sure it will give guidance to a lot of purchasers and also existing apartment owners out there who are actually living through these kind of circumstances that we're talking about. And we'll share your details both in the video, like just below the video, and also in the post that we push out to our audience. So really great information, and we'll have to get together and have a chat further. I'm sure there's lots of other issues and topics we can talk about in the future. So just to our audience, keep an eye out for Michael appearing in a webinar or another session into next year. So thank you very much, Michael, for your time.
You're welcome, Nikki, and thank you for the support you provide to us as well. It's a two-way street.
Definitely, always.